So when we look at places like Iran, and we're looking at the situation, Pastor Nardakani, it's the perfect storm in a sense, because not only do you have the government hostility, but you have the social hostility as well. And let me just explain an example of this. In Iran, there's a blood libel law basically that says that anybody in the country can kill with perfect impunity any Baha'i that they see. Now, the Baha'is are considered apostates to the Iranian regime and to many other Muslim governments, including in Egypt or in Iraq. They won't recognize them. But this has an effect on Christians as well, as we've seen with Pastor Nardakani, who's been imprisoned and given a death sentence. But Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran. But there are other countries where government hostility and social hostility don't necessarily work in tandem. And there are other countries that show that. In the Middle East and North Africa, this is where we have the highest government and social restrictions on religion. And the Americas and the UK would be the least restrictive. Among the world's 25 most populous countries, which account for about 2/3 of the world's population when you count places like India, China, etc. Places like Iran, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, these all stand out as having the most restrictions when both measures are taken into account. So we have a pretty grim picture. What do these restrictions look like? Well, in 75 countries, or about 38% of the countries, national or local governments limit efforts by religious groups or individuals to persuade others to join their faith. So that whole idea I said of proselytism being under attack, the very ability for us to carry out the Great Commission, 38% of the countries. In 178 countries, or 90% of the world's population, religious groups must register with their government. Now, this might seem like innocuous thing, not that big of a deal, but in many countries, the people can't register, and so they, in effect, have to operate illegally, and then they can be the frequent subject of raids by the government, or they will not receive other benefits by the government because of that. Social hostilities. These include mob or sectarian violence, like we've seen in Egypt, like we've seen in Nigeria, and another number of other countries. Public tensions between religious groups were reported in most of the countries that in the study that the Pew Forum and Brian Grimm did. 64% of these countries, hostilities involved physical violence. So what we see in Egypt, where you had the young student who, just because he had a cross that was in one of the pictures shown a few minutes ago, on his arm, the teacher incited the students to violently respond to him, and he was murdered in the school grounds, simply because of having a cross, which is pretty normal for many believers in Egypt. 25% of the people in these countries, there are private individuals or groups used force or threat of force to compel adherence to religious norms. Now, I think it's probably a lot higher than that, but this includes things like in India, when I traveled with David from CSW, and we went to Kandhamal district of Orissa, where we met with individuals that were forced to convert to Hinduism because the Hindu extremists and the Hindu extremist party in India, the VHP, believe that if you were born in India, you were always a Hindu, and so we need to convert you back to Hinduism, and that really Christianity and indigenous religions have no place in India. So social hostilities are very real and affect people in a very, very egregious manner. And then another major factor that was brought out in this study by Brian Grimm that I think is important, because it is one of the large trends in the world right now, is that religion-related terrorism has caused casualties in about 1 in 10 countries worldwide. One of the trends that we see is this increase in religious extremism and the link with the correlation with terrorism. And so Brian Grimm studied that and reported on that in the study as well. And I'll let you look at the study if you're interested in more details about that. On the next slide, Brian Grimm followed up on the 2009 report with a report that was just released a couple months ago. And in this report, he found that restrictions increased in I think it was 23 of the countries worldwide, but those 23 countries accounted for about a third of the world's population. So in the past 2 years since his study, and it looked at, I think, a four-year period, we saw restrictions increase exponentially in about 30% of the world's population. So in the past few years, we've seen a worsening of violations of religious freedom and of attacks on people because of their faith. He also was able to document that 2/3 of the world's population, as he had predicted in his last study, actually do live in countries that significantly persecute people for their faith. And then you can just read behind me, there's a number of places where these hostilities have increased: North Africa, China, Nigeria. In Europe, social hostilities have increased. Egypt in particular ranked very high on both government restrictions and social hostilities in the region. This was a new trend. So this study was actually done before the revolution, which is interesting. But one of the great things about Brian's studies is that they've shown us that we should be paying more attention to religious freedom, because it's a huge indicator of where social stability is headed and democracy is headed in a country. So I'm going to skip the next slide. As I mentioned, I'm going to go into a number of trends now to be a little bit more specific. I said the definition of religious freedom is under attack. If we look at the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights versus the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has a very different concept of religious freedom. And since I've been involved in this issue, I've witnessed the OIC countries, the Organization of Islamic Conference countries, get more and more involved in undermining the definition of religious freedom. Their definition is based on the Cairo Declaration, which subjects everything to Sharia, but also says that people don't have the freedom to change or to choose your faith. Now, when I mentioned this whole campaign on the defamation of religions, one of the things I didn't mention is that it was fought under not the religion item at the United Nations, which would be pretty normal for a religious issue, but it was fought under the racism agenda item. And the reason this is important for us is because the OIC and under the Cairo Declaration, the countries in it believe that religion is an immutable characteristic, in the same way that sex or gender or ethnicity are immutable characteristics. The problem for us, though, as believers, is that if it's immutable, then the Hindu extremists are right and people should be converted back to Hinduism, because that's what they were born into if they were born in India. Or if they're born in the Muslim world, then they shouldn't be allowed to leave Islam. And so if we believe in the Great Commission that people should be free to search for the truth, find it, and follow it in accordance with their conscience, then this is a big problem. So one of the trends that I think that is really one of the biggest trends next to this association with rising extremism is the changing definition of religious freedom, and that really comes out of the Cairo Declaration and a movement that they've been working on. Actually in tandem with the UN, they met first in, I believe, 1997 with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN to discuss their new definition of human rights and religious freedom specifically, and it was ever after that that they began to introduce these resolutions on defamation. So the fact that we were able to push back and defeat that resolution this year through a coalition CSW is involved in was really a huge success that everybody here that has been involved in CSW should be very proud of, because it affects our ability to proselytize. You have laws in Nigeria condemning the shaking the faith of a Muslim, and we've had a number of Christians in prison there and that have shared their faith and been imprisoned for doing so because of laws there. And then, like I mentioned, Iran. Another trend worldwide that we see is just the whole idea of trying to force religion out of the public square. We have a really big problem in the Middle East right now, and I think, as the bishop said earlier, Egypt is really going to be the litmus test for what happens in that region on whether Christians are free to really practice their faith freely in the future. And they've lived under this kind of persecution there for 2,000 years, and for the last 1,300 years they have been living as second-class citizens under it. And so I think that most people don't want to live that way anymore, and there will be a change. We don't know which way. But what we see is that these countries are grappling with what the role of religion will be in their countries in the future. And it's important for us to, as believers that want to share our faith freely, know that religion obviously shouldn't be forced out of public space, because that would force our views, our conscience rights out of the public space as well. But with growing extremism, we need to find out what the balance should be in any society. And so that's something that they're trying to figure out right now, and that will be that we're going to have to watch and see, and that hopefully we can speak into and say that, you know, religion can be free in public space, and not, you don't need to be afraid of it, suppress it, or force people to support some nationalistic identity to the detriment of their belief. That we can respect religion in the public space and yet and still all get along in some way. So those are things that we're grappling with. We see the erasure of ancient religious communities, whether it's in Iraq. I've traveled to Iraq 4 times in the past year, so I've seen this firsthand, and it's extremely saddening to see ancient communities, not just Christians, but Yazidis, which is an ancient Zoroastrian community, Mandaeans are actually followers of John the Baptist. They had about 50,000 believers when the war began in Iraq, and now they're down to about 5,000 believers. So they've taken a tremendous hit to their community. Blasphemy and apostasy laws have exacerbated religious intolerance. You see the rise of, or the association of nationalism with religious extremism, such as Hindu nationalism. You see countries justifying restrictions on religious freedom for the purpose of preserving morals. And the list goes on. You can see behind me, there's rising restrictions all over the world in a number of different trends. The political reshuffling in the Middle East. So all of the negatives. Let me talk about some positives before I close. As I said, we were able to defeat the defamation resolution at the UN. We were able to maintain the role of a special rapporteur at the UN for religious freedom, which was being undermined. We've been able to oppose some new religion laws, like the one in Algeria, and it was kept under wraps for a little bit of time. There's renewed attention, like you saw today, to the concern of the religious minorities in Egypt. There's a huge international coalition that's not just Christian, but of a number of faith communities that believe that they each have the right to practice their faith freely. This is a positive change. And then we see technology and the advances that we've made there. So these are positive steps, and we need to do more. One of the things that I've done over the years is I've had the benefit of working for a number of members of Congress and with CSW on legislation. And so David and Kataza have both been excellent resources for me in their research on the ground and what I can do to make better policy for the U.S. government, so that we don't take the defensive approach anymore, we take a more offensive approach. And we did that earlier this year with a bill that we introduced on Pakistan that was really significant. We're going to be doing that on India. So we're looking at ways and working with CSW to find out, okay, how can we take what we know and find a way to address these trends offensively, so that we're not on the defense, because ultimately we shouldn't be. We should know where the victory lies for us. And I think, just to close, going back to what I said at the beginning with Daniel, and studying it this year, I met a young man that on one of my trips that had asked me, Tina, have you ever suffered for your faith? And I said, no, I really haven't suffered in the way you've suffered, but I know for all of us that following Christ is going to be an offense to people that don't believe that what he says is truth. And this is something that as Christians we all have a cross to take up daily. And I think that getting to know the persecuted believers that I've met and working with them and learning more about them through CSW and other groups has given me that window into a part of the body of Christ that I need, that I can feel connected to and help stand up for and pray for, and help to have that patient endurance that God has called all of us to. And in a way, they're taking a stance to live when they know that it's possibly at the pain of death. But sometimes living for our faith here is just as difficult as dying for our faith somewhere else. And so in leaving, I'll simply just say that I hope that all of us today can come away from this conference knowing where the victory lies in the end, and knowing that really we do have the power of Christ within us to stand with our brothers and sisters around the world and to live every day for him. So, thank you.